Let's turn to Madeleine Rivera, who is live in Washington, D.C. with the very latest. And Maddie, Ukraine is the major emphasis this morning, as we're learning there's been some positive developments with negotiations.
Yeah, Good morning, Carly and Todd. Yeah, a lot of optimism on both sides here. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says the talks with Ukrainian officials in Geneva over the weekend was perhaps the most productive engagement they've ever had on the Ukraine war. He's not declaring victory just yet, but says they're further along than they were.
We arrived here today with one goal, and the goal was to take, is 28 points or 26 points, depending on which version as it continued to evolve, and try to narrow the ones that were open items. And we have achieved that today in a very substantial way.
Now, the way Rubio put it, this roughly 28-point plan began with a foundational document that the U.S. put together 3 weeks ago with input from Russia and Ukraine. That's important given the confusion that came out over the last 48 hours after a bipartisan group of lawmakers said this was not a U.S. proposal. Rubio did not get into what they discussed yesterday. Critics, though, have warned against giving in to Russian demands like handing the Kremlin Ukraine's territory in the eastern Donbass region and ruling out NATO membership for Ukraine. But even as the talks were going on, President Trump went on Truth Social to criticize Ukraine, saying, "I inherited a war that should have never happened, a war that is a loser for everyone, especially the millions of people that have so needlessly died. Ukraine leadership has expressed zero gratitude for our efforts, and Europe continues to buy oil from Russia." Rubio did go on later to say that the president was pleased with the talks. Ukrainian President Zelensky saying on X, "We appreciate so deeply that so many forces and leaders are working for peace right now. Ukraine is grateful to the United States, to every American heart, and personally to President Trump for the assistance that, starting with the javelins, has been saving Ukrainian lives." Rubio says they'd like to stick to a Thanksgiving deadline, but suggested that might change depending on the progress that they're making. The president said something similar last week to Brian Kilmeade. Carly and Todd.
Madeleine Rivera live for us in Washington. Maddie, thank you. And NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte will join Fox and Friends later this morning to discuss the latest on these critical negotiations.
U.S. military leaders slated to visit Puerto Rico today to meet with troops and express gratitude for their dedicated work in the America First missions across the Caribbean.
This visit comes as the U.S. is reportedly getting ready to ramp up a new phase in operations against Nicolas Maduro's regime in Venezuela. The U.S. so far has taken out a total of 21 suspected drug boats in September, killing at least 82 narco-terrorists in the process.
Joining us now, former Navy captain and senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Brent Sadler. Sir, great to see you as always. Describe what the scope and timing of these potential operations with regard to Venezuela could be.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on this morning. The ongoing attacks against these narcotics trafficking vessels working for a host of drug cartels based largely out of Maduro's Venezuela continue to apply pressure on where and how these cartels survive, their business model. But it's going to take quite a while still. There's quite a number of these vessels, and there's about a $690 billion trade just in cocaine that goes from the south to the north to the U.S. markets. And that doesn't really include that which is going over to Europe as well. So we're still into what looks like to be a months-long assault against these drug cartels.
As for the mission, the administration says, of course, that this is all about preventing drugs from entering the country. But we're taking a much different tactic when it comes to Venezuela as opposed to countries like China and Mexico. When it comes to that goal of why this is taking place, what do you believe that is?
Well, I think the goal, and if you look at the scope of the attacks, they've been attacking drug smuggling vessels. Many of them have been observed for many years by groups like the Joint Interagency Task Force South and partner nations that have been trying to interdict these drug runners for years, decades actually, going back to the late 80s. But when those attacks extended to the Pacific, it was clear they're going after the drug cartels' bottom line, the ability to move product to market and make money. It's less about directly attacking the Maduro regime. Of course, the Maduro regime survives because of the largesse and the muscle of these drug cartels. So if the drug cartels go out of business, so does the Maduro regime.
Meantime, all eyes on Ukraine, specifically what is happening in Europe right now to try to reach a peace in Ukraine. Secretary of State Marco Rubio touting his progress and optimism on the peace deal between Russia and Ukraine after the Geneva talks held over the weekend. But they got a lot of bipartisan criticism. Take a listen.
So I'm not going to speculate or go into the details of any of the specific items in the latest version of the proposal because, frankly, by tomorrow or the next day, that may have evolved and changed further. And but I can tell you, I guess, that I feel very optimistic that we can get something done here because we made a tremendous amount of progress today.
This initial plan would be a total capitulation by Ukraine. I think it would go down, frankly, as a historically bad deal.
I would not advise Ukraine to sign this. They can't sign an agreement like the Budapest and then allow Russia to invade again.
Yeah, and to be abundantly clear, a lot of that bipartisan criticism that we saw on the Sunday shows came before Marco Rubio made that announcement there. But looking ahead, at the end of the day, this all comes back to securing an agreement that Russia actually sticks to. Do you anticipate that such an agreement exists, Brent?
Well, there's no agreement right now that exists because they're still in the phase of negotiating it. And many of the comments, I think, are a bit premature because we don't know the full details. Ukraine has just had their round of looking at it and tweaking on it. The Russians are next, so there's going to be more changes. The key metric to look at is, can a sustainable peace be delivered through the mechanism of the ceasefire? And it's going to require both armed forces stepping back about no less than 20 kilometers from each other from what is today the effective front line or the line of control. But that line of control that gets frozen has to be one that if either side decides to reinitiate hostilities, the risk and the cost on them is so high that they'll actually refrain from doing it. So there will be adjustments in that front line to ensure that's the case. Many of the other details are still fluid and moving, so probably best to see what comes out in the coming days. But the only thing that hasn't been mentioned in any of these discussions and in the drafts that have been leaked is what happens in the Black Sea. And I think that's a place where the Russians could be very vulnerable and could be a way in which to check any future aggression. It's also the only way that Ukraine remains economically independent.
Yeah, and Secretary Rubio sounded extremely pleased with how these talks went yesterday. He said he wasn't going to release any details because they could change by today or tomorrow, but we eagerly await those new details to come out. Former Navy captain and senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Brent Sadler, we thank you so much for joining us.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.